So first, I'd like to say that I agree with everything that Dr. Jones said yesterday. So, so I have little to add, especially about positive freedom, because this is one of the main things that I'll be referring to, especially when I'm referring to freedom. So keep that in the back of your mind. The title of my presentation is The Sixth City, Cádiz and the Tradition of Freedom in the Spanish Constitution. And it is obviously the title of my presentation is a little bit both serious and in jest. Cádiz was obviously not part of the history of American order, therefore it cannot really be accounted as one of Russell Kirk's cities. And although my goal is to show you that the example of Cádiz is worth considering because it challenges some of our fundamental assumptions about the meaning of liberalism, order, modernity, it is important to recognize that Cádiz, more than a city, was a brief spring blossom in a history that would become but a hatchet relentlessly hacking at the roots of order. Cádiz was, in its best interpretation, a fading comet that flashed across the darkening sky of the age of revolution, leaving its burning trace only in the memory of a few. But it is nonetheless a symbol that points to a deeper reality, to an almost forgotten tradition of freedom. Now, my title is partly in jest, but it's also serious. So, and it has a reason for it, and it is that in the last few pages of Russell Kirk's The Roots of American Order, which we've been reading this week, he devotes a series of reflections that are cautiously optimistic about modernity and the future. What is curious is that in order to do this, Kirk relies for the first time in his work on two very important Spanish thinkers of the 20th century, Miguel de Unamuno and his once removed disciple, Julián Marías. Kirk refers to Unamuno as a philosopher of dignity and freedom, and quotes Marías to warn the reader against the rashness and radicalism that destroy order. He titles this section In God's Own Time and relies on the Spanish thinkers, not particularly known for their patience, to admonish readers against the impatience of radicalism. This suggests that Kirk considered both Marías and Unamuno particularly insightful, certainly enough to use them as guideposts of his concluding reflections. But the question is, of course, why? What about these two thinkers called his attention? We could perhaps dismiss these questions and think that it was just a sort of passing comment or that he was attracted to a couple of lines. But beginnings and ends in books are very important, not just the middles. And I think that frontiers in general, as the beginning and the end of a book, are particularly insightful. So I want to suggest that perhaps what rang so true to Kirk emerges from the same well than that which called the attention of John Adams as he traveled through northern Spain in 1779. Adams had accidentally arrived in Finisterre, Spain, literally. Finisterre is the end of the earth. Again, in the border. At that time, it was the border of the known world, well, at least up until 1492, when Columbus sailed across the sea to expand the ecumene of the earth and turn the border into the center. And of course, then we created another frontier in America that we kept on pushing west until America became the center. And that is our relationship to frontiers. John Adams had a lot of unexpected obstacles through this trip, but as he traveled through the Biscay Bay in the northern regions of Spain, he observed with surprise the, quote, respect of the Spanish nation and their kings for the ancient liberties of the local communities and provinces. Like much of Iberian history, both Unamuno and Marías have remained largely unknown to the history of philosophy and to the West. It is important to add here that they were also both self-proclaimed liberals, though not in the way that we might imagine today. They were heirs of the liberalismo doceañista, which is the liberal tradition of the Cádiz Constitution of 1812. As we will see, this form of liberalism has a very particular history, a self-understanding, and should occupy a central place in studies and reflections on liberalism and its relationship to order and freedom. So I'm going to try to convince you that liberalism is not as bad as we think. We'll see if I succeed. Yet the attention given to Iberian thought and history has been episodic at best. And despite the brief yet meaningful consideration Kirk gives to Unamuno and Marias, he did not give as much attention to the world that they came from. This oversight, however, is not an oversight on Kirk's part, it's a civilizational oversight. Although the last few decades have seen a significant increase in some interest towards this, the Iberian history and politics, its relationship to the rest of the Western civilization remains at best obscure. After all, Spain, as well as the rest of Iberia and Latin America, to this day is seen as rather mysterious, enigmatic, and ultimately backwards. Despite being an integral part of the history of Western civilization, the Iberian Peninsula often seems to float like an island, adrift somewhere between modernity and underdevelopment. As W.H. Auden once said, Spain was that fragment nibbed up of hot Africa, soldered so crudely to inventive Europe. So this is the place where I would like to start from today, from this understanding. And through the example of the Cádiz Constitution of 1812, I'd like to show two main things. First, that Spain has a profound history of freedom that is inextricably tied to the origin of the term liberalism. And second, that this example further articulates the way in which freedom is not merely an abstract absence from constraints, but is defined by the particular demands and duties of community and friendship, and that most importantly, it is an inward reality of the order of the soul which reveals the transcendent. So first, the Cádiz Constitution, what happened in Cádiz? The Napoleonic troops invaded Spain in 1808 and usurped the throne of Fernando VII, who had just assumed it from his father, Carlos IV, after a bunch of confrontations, and the crown had actually already lost quite a bit of prestige because of all these confrontations between father and son. And the existing tensions in the Spanish crown were exacerbated by the Napoleonic invasion, and Napoleon took the opportunity, he seized power and gave power to his brother Joseph, who would become Joseph I. The occupation sent waves of concern through the whole Spanish and Spanish-American territories, which resulted in the formation of small groups called juntas. They sort of assembled in these little local groups that formed a larger junta that then created what was known as the Cortes of Cádiz, which gathered also in the end of the earth in Cádiz, which is at the very tip of southwestern Spain. And part of the idea of the Cortes was it was based on the old medieval Cortes that they had is a court. In the decree of September 24th of 1810, the Cortes declared their claim to national sovereignty and outlined their objective to resist the French invasion by creating a constitutional monarchy that would expel Joseph I and reinstate the Bourbon dynasty with the return of Ferdinand VII. The group that formed the Cortes was composed by a group of intellectuals, politicians, priests, and lawyers from what was known as Las Españas, which was not just Spain, but both sides of the Atlantic. So there were several representatives there also from the Americas. And they had what we could characterize broadly as two different views of what should happen. The first group was the strict royalists who sought to return to the régimen antiguo, to the old regime, and they saw the Cortes as merely a sort of custodian for power while they expelled the French so that the king could come back and assume the power just as it was before. This group understood, the second group was composed of those who came to be known as los liberales, and this group had in turn quite a wide range of views, from the more conservative and moderate to the more radical reformers. Very importantly, however, even the radical liberales did not intend to get rid of the monarchic system, much less to behead any kings. Their proposals, to be sure, were deeply transformative to the old absolute monarchic power, as they sought to impose limitation on the king that were eventually seen as excessive and did not actually make it to the constitution. This was the most radical side of the liberal group. But there was this other more moderate side, and the constitution emerged as a sort of compromise and conversation and dialectic between all these groups. But what's important to note is that even the most radical liberales saw themselves as doing something opposite and very different to what they had seen happen in France. This is not to say that they were not influenced by certain Enlightenment thinkers, but they had seen sort of the failures of the French Revolution and saw their project as fundamentally different. Indeed, in his opening speech, Agustín Argüelles, which was one of the main framers of the Constitution, referred to the French Revolution as that disastrous revolution. And he introduced the first draft of the Constitution by saying the following: "The draft Constitution offers nothing that has not been established in the most authentic and solemn way in the different bodies of Spanish legislation, but rather the method that has distributed the matters, ordering and classifying them so that they form a system of fundamental law. And this fundamental law is in accordance as provided by the fundamental laws of Aragon, Navarra, and Castilla. It was understood as being based on the continuation of the leyes fundamentales, of the fundamental laws of the Spanish Middle Ages." The history of the Cádiz Constitution is not obviously a monologic narrative, and it was filled with complexities and vicissitudes that we wouldn't have the time to explore here. And some have argued that it was more revolutionary than one met the eye, and some have argued that it wasn't revolutionary enough. But I think it's important to consider a few aspects to show this spirit that I'm trying to convey, that it was a spirit of reform, not a spirit of revolution. And we will only mention two. First, the relationship with the Catholic Church. The Cádiz Constitution was in no way, they did not see it in any way opposed to the church. In fact, there was no question about it being, about there being freedom of religion. It was Article 12 of the Constitution says that the Catholic religion is and always will be the official religion of the Spanish nation, and that other religions would be prohibited. Yet at the same time, it declared unconstitutional the institution of the Inquisition. So it was reformist, but it was not revolutionary. Second, in relationship to the monarchy, the whole reason for the being of the Cortes was, as I mentioned, to expel the French invaders and to reinstitute Ferdinand II as the rightful king. However, as reformers, the framers saw the need to do so through what they called a hereditary moderate monarchy. Articles 14 to 17 of the Constitution outline the details of the monarchic rule with a division of powers. The executive power would reside in the king, the legislative power would be shared by the king and the Cortes, and the judicial power would be under the judges. The liberal constitution did not emerge as a revolt against monarchy, but as an effort to reclaim what was known as the official Spain, la España oficial, with its medieval roots and way of life, taking it back from the foreign invaders. But the Napoleonic occupation had not gone without some significant consequences. It had created a new form of division, because there were those who, doubtful of the ability of Spain to fight back and to reclaim its sovereignty, sided with the French. And they saw themselves, these came to be known as the afrancesados, which means like the Frenchies or something. And these group of people started supporting the French invasion because it was a kind of opportunistic way of playing your cards to the ones that you think are going to win. But it also created some very strong pro-Spain sentiments that were far more radical than than what had existed before. So this is what Julián Marías would call the induced radicalization of Spain, which was a sort of tearing of the fabric of Spanish society and a radicalization that would never really get resolved. The problem was that Fernando VII, after the constitution came, was official in 1812, they had a lot of hopes for Fernando to return and to support it, but Fernando VII was not the great statesman that the times required. And I quote Julián Marías here. He says, "While the war lasted, the unity of the Spanish people against the French covers up a profound divergence. When it is over, when Spain is about to reestablish its life anew and begin its reconstruction, a deeper and poorly concealed separation of society reemerges. The point of convergence could have been King Fernando VII, but crippled by the cowardice that he had suffered from his youth and that would continue to cripple him, he takes the most extreme course of action and sides against those who had fought to defend his throne during the invasion and had attempted a sensible political reform in accordance with the exigencies of the time. The absolutism of Ferdinand VII reestablishes something that was nothing to do with the monarchy of the kings from the 18th century, which in turn had nothing to do with personal, dictatorial, or tyrannical power." End quote. So on May 4th of 1814, Fernando VII issues a decree which rendered the constitution illegitimate and issues for a new age of absolutism. This new power was voluntaristic, violent, and for the first time, explicitly anti-liberal. This is the source, I would argue, of the misconception that liberalism is against the crown and the crown is against liberalism, particularly in the Spanish context. In the end, the French invasion, the short life of the Constitution, and the subsequent reinstitution of absolutism left in Spain a torn social fabric. For this reason, Julián Marías has said that the War of Independence was the most serious commotion that Spain confronted since it became a unified nation, and it's only comparable to the Civil War. In fact, the argument would be that it culminates in the Civil War, that sort of division endures through the 19th century and early 20th century, through all the Carlist wars, and ends up in the Civil War. But why does this matter besides historical curiosity? I would suggest that it matters because this history is tied to the origin of the term liberal. We live in a time of deep crisis. Radical critiques of our glaring failings are ubiquitous, and illiberal, anti-liberal, and post-liberal alternatives on the right and the left have emerged with newfound force. The right, accurately pointing at the incoherence and nihilism of modernity, has a hard time moving past the stage of diagnosis, struggling to propose a viable antidote that goes beyond nostalgia. The left, refusing to take guidance from God, history, or nature, pushes for a technocratic, nihilistic pseudo-Jacobin internationalism worthy of the most extravagant science fiction novels. Meanwhile, both conservative and progressive liberals struggle to propose a vision that captivates the imagination of our brave new world. Liberalism, we hear everywhere, contains the seeds of its own destruction, yet we fail to consider that all things human contain the seeds of their own destruction. Indeed, the fundamental reality of a political regime, as Plato had already shown us, is one of a struggle against its own impermanence. And the only guarantee of its stability is the constant rediscovery and renovation of its sources of order and meaning. This is in great part what Kirk was trying to do with his book. The crisis of liberalism is a larger, deeper crisis of order and meaning. And we tend to think that it is ill-equipped or even to blame for this crisis. The problem, however, is not so much the threat of chaos and tyranny, I would argue, because that is a constant presence in human life, but it is the absence of any countervailing forces of union, of a shared conception of the common good that enables the destructive powers to appear so strong. We cannot, of course, go into a full discussion of the meaning of liberalism, but I would just like to add some nuance to what we already know about it that may perhaps lead to a more fruitful way to think about our modern problems. It was during the Cortes of Cádiz, as we have suggested, that the term liberal was first used to describe a political self-understanding. The Italian thinker Benedetto Croce pointed out that the term liberal in a political sense was first coined in Spain in the Cádiz Constitution of 1812. This point has been qualified by some scholars in later studies. Daniel Klein, for example, rightly argues that in the Scottish context, the word liberal had already begun to be used in a political sense, starting with the work of historian William Robertson and with Adam Smith in the late 1700s. With large data surveys, Klein shows that many instances in which this term starts to move from being used as generosity or magnanimity to something explicitly political. But our point is that what is peculiar about the gathering of Cádiz of 1812 is that there was a semantic transformation in the term where the adjective liberal started to be used as the noun liberal. It was a self-description with a more precise meaning that discloses not just a generally open politics of economics, but the self-understanding of a group of political actors that saw themselves as carrying a specific liberal tradition founded upon medieval practices and with a specific liberal vision that was not revolutionary. Juan Marichal, another Spanish thinker, he did a study called El Secreto de España, where he addresses this point and explains exactly how the term liberal came to be from simply referring to certain politics or certain economic or policies or political suggestions to move from referring to them as liberal to saying we are los liberales, we are the liberals. The important point for political theory, however, is not so much about who invented the term, obviously, but about its meaning. And what I want to suggest here is that if we take this story of the Cádiz Constitution seriously and realize the place that it occupies in the development of the term, at the very least, it challenges some of our assumptions about the meaning of the term. Or at least it should at least be part of the conversation of what the term exactly means. Francisco Martínez Marina, for example, one of the intellectual fathers of the Cádiz Constitution as well, is an interesting person to pay attention, because in him we see the attempt to blend a kind of a British French Enlightenment philosophy with the scholastic philosophical tradition that loomed very large in Southern Europe. And the result was an unorthodox combination which privileges individual liberty while maintaining strong communal ties. So it wasn't a matter of either or. The Spanish liberal tradition in this view was not a primarily intellectual movement that emerged in the Enlightenment, but it was the articulation of local liberal practices that had begun in the Middle Ages, already expressed in Spanish scholasticism, or at least beginning to be expressed in Spanish scholasticism, that found its justification in enlightened language of the 18th and 19th centuries. And I quote Brandon Wessler here, who says, "Even before the development of liberalism, Spain had enjoyed a long tradition of popular government that rivaled and in some regards bettered its Western European neighbors. Spain developed an early tradition of popular participation with the rise of democratic town government in the 12th and 13th centuries. Many local positions, including mayors and justices, were already being appointed by popular vote. In this way, the members of the Cortes of Cádiz were trying to articulate this sort of tradition that we had already seen developed in the Middle Ages. The testimony of the continuity that this liberal articulation had with the Spanish tradition can be found in the medieval documents that became a whole movement that they were called the fueros, which were the medieval charters that would allow local communities certain privileges and independence in relation to the crown. This is what was known as the nacionalismo histórico, like the historic national approach. And it was based on the premise that in Spain, modern political liberties and constitutional rights originated in medieval traditions, and that those traditions could be corroborated by means of these legal documents called fueros, which gave, the rights to preserve the rights in relation to feudal lords and monarchs. Therefore, the Iberian world, or at least a significant part of it, perhaps not all of it, but a part of it, understood itself as beginning its process of liberalization in the medieval era. And we saw the writing of the Constitution, and they saw the writing of the Constitution not as a revolutionary activity, but as a continuation of this tradition. Moreover, not only Spanish liberalism was a unique part of the Iberian world, but it emerged, as we have said, explicitly against the Napoleonic invasion. It was a liberalism that was permeated by a disposition of prudence and reform above revolution. And this is, it can be seen in another text that I will read a little part of here by Gaspar Melchor de Jovellanos, which was sort of thought as the quintessential Spanish Enlightenment thinker. He died before the Constitution was finished, but lived through the first few years of the Constitution, and it'll give you a sense of how different the Enlightenment in Spain perhaps was from the others. In a letter, Jovellanos says, "You will perhaps say," this is a letter that he's writing to a British consul, and he says, "You will perhaps say that our remedies are slow. This is true, but there are no other remedies, and if there are, I will not support them. I have already said it, I will never agree to sacrifice the present generation for the sake of future ones. You approve of the spirit of rebellion, I do not. I openly disagree. I am very far from believing that there is any merit to such spirit. I believe that an enlightening nation can carry out reforms without blood, that in order to achieve enlightenment, rebellion is not necessary. Progress supposes a gradual development, and its direction will be guided by each and every step that it takes. All else will not be called progress, because it is something else." If we take this point seriously, and if we consider the genesis of the term, we may say that liberalism, at least in the Spanish version, is not an ideology. It is not a revolutionary philosophy of abstract rights that sees itself as opposed to tradition, but it is a movement of political freedom that does not define freedom as the emancipation of constraints, but defines it by its own tradition according to its own practices. Yet Cádiz failed, which is an important point. Despite the fact that the history of the Cádiz Constitution saw itself truncated by the many difficulties of the French invasion, by the regime changes and the brief liberal interludes of the 19th century, there was also, I would argue, a persistent, specifically Spanish liberal consciousness and tradition that endured all the way to the 20th century. Miguel de Unamuno, who we cited at the beginning, is perhaps the best example of this. Unamuno saw himself not just as part of any liberalism or any liberal tradition. He was a self-proclaimed liberal, but he saw himself as a liberal of the Cádiz Constitution of 1812. And I quote him when he says, "When I replay the memories of my liberal heritage, of the doceañista 1812 origin, and when I feel that means and methods meant to lift barriers, dogmas, or dictatorships are destroyed, that free examination of conscience is denied in order to impose this or that inquisition, I feel the confirmation and conviction of my family tradition of liberalism that originated from the glorious 19th century, the liberalism of the Cádiz Constitution of 1812. Unamuno was a liberal theorist and a public intellectual, but he was more than a liberal theorist and a public intellectual. In fact, this sense of being liberal, and more than liberal, I would argue, is the essence of understanding this type of liberalism well. Most of his efforts were not devoted to writing about liberalism and its challenges, but to an exploration of the transcendence of inwardness and of the depths of the human heart. Questions about regimes, institutions, and inner mechanisms of politics, though important, were always secondary to the fundamental question of the personal participation in the order of transcendence. Unamuno understood that the political is a manifestation of the existential, and that unless there is an inward disposition to participate in the order of existence, there is no possibility of sound political judgment and action. In other words, the ability to see truth presupposes the order of the soul. This conception of reality, this openness to transcendence, is what allowed Unamuno to understand the problem of liberalism, not in the narrow terms of rights and secularization, but as part of the fundamental problem of the human condition. He understood with Plato that the city is the soul writ large, and that if there is to be any political freedom, it must be grounded in an inward spiritual freedom. This is why during a time of great political turmoil, the one that Unamuno lived, leading up to from the Third Carlist War to the beginning of the Civil War, rather than laboring to justify the structure of liberalism, Unamuno did something very interesting, which is he turned to the writing of what he called spiritual essays. The primary objective of these spiritual essays was also the most deeply political: to shake readers out of their existential stupor into the disquieting vigil of their freedom, to elicit in the person an encounter with the abyss and transcendence of their own condition. And I will read a quote by him. Towards the end of this is something that he writes at the very end of his book, that is a commentary on Don Quixote, still the longest commentary on Don Quixote ever written, and worthy of checking out if you like that book. Look, reader, he says, although I do not know you, I love you so much that if I could have you in my hands, I would open up your chest, and in the core of your heart I would dig a wound and pour vinegar and salt in it, so that you may never rest, and so that you may live in the perpetual restlessness of unending desire. If I have not managed to disquiet you with my Quixote, it is, believe me, due to my own clumsiness, and because this dead paper, which cannot scream or squeal or sigh or cry, is insufficient, for language was never made so that we may understand each other. The goal of Unamuno is to shake the liberal modern into the disquiet of inwardness, because it is only there that the self-transcending reality of freedom becomes apparent. It is in inwardness that we encounter transcendence, and without internal freedom, no external action is truly free. In 1927, he would write, "There is no other politics than to save the individual in history. It is not about ensuring the victory of a particular doctrine or party, or about expanding a nation's territory, or about toppling a social order. None of these are worth very much if it is not to save the individual soul of individual people." But there's something very interesting here, because what he means by individual is very peculiar. I would argue that is much better captured by the word person than by the word individual. Here he's in this next paragraph that I'll read is a bit of an insight into what he means by it. He says, "I am a man, no other man do I deem a stranger. For to me the adjective humanus is not less suspect than its abstract substantive humanitas, humanity. Neither the human nor humanity, neither the simple adjective nor the substantivized adjective, but the concrete substantive, man, the man of flesh and bone, the man who is born and suffers and dies, above all, the man who dies, the man who eats and drinks and plays and sleeps and thinks and loves, the man who is seen and heard, the brother, the real brother." You see that the concept that Unamuno is working with here when he's talking about the salvation of the individual souls in history, it is a concept that more of the anthropology of the person within the Christian context. You know, the person is defined by the other. In fact, the other, as you know, philosophers like Buber or Levinas would later say, is closer to us than our own self. It is not that we develop an individual and then enter into a social reality, but the relationships are prior to even our own concept of self. And the fundamental relationship, obviously, is the relationship with God. Unamuno's solution was not a particularly political plan, but the awareness of a Spanish tradition of freedom that, just like it had resisted the extremes of the old regime and revolution in 1812, it could resist the radicalization of communism and fascism in its time. Amid the emergence of the authoritarian and ideological forces that would ravage the 20th century, Unamuno fought to defend the freedom and dignity of persons with implacable intensity, even at the expense of his own freedom first and his life eventually. In the example of Unamuno, we find not a path or a solution for what to do about it, for he abhorred paths and solutions, lest we fall for the illusion that freedom is not at the center of reality. We find in Unamuno an existential challenge the dagger of freedom and the light of transcendence, a philosophy of the person that relentlessly fights to defend human dignity from the threats of evil and its political manifestations. We find the medieval and modern spirit together, the same spirit that we could see in the Cádiz Constitution of 1812. And I quote Unamuno again. He says, "I sense that I have a medieval soul, that the soul of my land is medieval, that this soul has been dragged by force through the Renaissance, the Reform, and the Revolution, learning, yes, from them, but without allowing them to alter its soul, preserving the spiritual inheritance of those times that they call dark. And that Quixotismo is nothing but the most desperate struggle of the Middle Ages against the Renaissance that emerged from them." The will to dominate, though, through its reductionism and manipulation of transcendence, has always been and always will be the latent force of disorder in politics and in the human spirit. And its opposite, the humble disposition of participation in order, a true freedom, is the only resistance and the only shield against the seduction of power and tyranny and excess. This is perhaps why Kirk chose Unamuno and Marias to guide him through the conclusion of his work. Of course, this does not mean that liberalism is not in deep crisis or that it should be taken as an ideological solution to any problem. But understanding it as the tradition of freedom can give us the clarity to see the real threat, perhaps. The threat that Unamuno identified in his anti-ideological fight at the turn of the century and his anti-totalitarian fight in the years leading up to the Spanish Civil War. That the pool of evil in the human heart, with its disorienting force, is the constant threat to political order. This, Unamuno would have suggested, is not so much a problem of liberalism, but a problem of the human condition, of the will to dominate that exists always in the human heart. The difficulty is that precisely because the disorienting force of evil is such a constant tendency for the person, it is often difficult to identify, particularly within ourselves. We are the worst judges of this in our own selves. Confusion, disorder, and manipulation are the currency of evil. The real threat, then, may not be a politics of freedom, but a tyranny that uses the language of liberalism to consolidate power under its despotic rule, just like there was a time that the language of virtue may have used to justify absolutist abuse, or like the language of tradition and progress can be manipulated to serve power in different ways. The language of liberalism, unhinged from its transcendent source, can be used to eradicate the very thing it is meant to signify and protect, namely freedom. Perhaps the first step towards the recovery of order and meaning in our era is to start by understanding the transcendence of freedom and the responsibility that we bear. Perhaps we begin understanding that indeed freedom is responsibility. That responsibility is the glow that illuminates freedom, and that in the absence of this light, there is only the dark abyss of nihilism. We begin by looking at our liberal practices and acknowledging that responsibility may in fact be the quintessential virtue of the liberal regime. We may begin by realizing with Unamuno that the other is always prior to the I, that existence itself is an inexorable moral demand, and that its fulfillment is the most fundamental meaning of freedom. Existence is defined by the irrevocable encounter with the other, with the person, a condition of inextricably binding responsibility that relentlessly calls us to self-sacrifice. Thank you.